A young girl murdered, a wrongful conviction, and decades worth of waiting to finally get to the truth. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Christine Jessop. Viewer discretion is advised. Christine Marion Jessop was born on November 29th, 1974, and she was born in the little town of Queensville, which is in Ontario, Canada. Or was a little town, at least back then. I guess Queensville really consisted of like a handful of houses, a general store, and a park, and then like a nearby school back in 1974 when she was born. This is one of those communities that everybody knew everybody. Everybody knows your name. No, don't do that. Okay. But like you could walk down the street and say, hey, Fred, and they're like, hey, Cheryl, like everyone just knew each other. Therefore, there really wasn't any strangers in the community. Everyone just kind of felt trusted with one another. Fast forwarding to 1984, when this case takes place, it's pretty much the exact same scenario. Parents back then would just say, hey kids, go outside and play and don't come back until the streetlights come on, kind of thing. And the kids would, they would play all afternoon after school, then they would come home for dinner, and parents didn't need to be outside keeping a watchful eye on the kids 24/7. It was just seemingly a safer time. But the reality is it really wasn't. By the time Christine Jessop was 9 years old, she was considered a kind of like a mix of a tomboy, but also a girl's girl, She would love to watch and play baseball with her older brother, but then she would also flip and play with her dolls. She had a little pet, frog in their basement that she would take very good care of. And she had a dog that she loved, a beagle named Freckles. There were two of them, were like thick as thieves. Her frog, by the way, was named Harold, of course. She was, like I said, an adventurer, an explorer. She would love to be outside. And I guess there was like this cemetery behind their neighborhood or their house. And she would kind of frequently play in that area. But then there was also a park across the street from the general store, which was just down the road, that she would also play at with her friends. She was a very affectionate and emotional young girl, it seems like, especially when it came to animals. There's a story I read that I guess one night she saw some baby chicks outside her house, and so she didn't want them to be alone, and so she curled up next to them outside and slept with them so that they wouldn't be alone. She was just someone who was just full of excitement, full of life, a lot of pep in her step, and she was just a kid, and she loved being a kid. It was October 3rd, 1984. Janet Jessop, Christine's mom, had been in Toronto that day. Christine had got out of school that afternoon, and there would be like a 20-minute little window of time between when Janet would arrive home and when Christine arrived home. So basically for 20 minutes, Christine would be home alone. Which back then, just considering the neighborhood, considering the environment, considering the times, it was like, okay, it's 20 minutes. It's not a big deal. According to classmates, Christine was super excited that day. She was happy. I guess she was in music class and she was given a recorder by her music teacher, and she was so excited to come home and show it to her, to her mom and her brother. Her dad was not going to be home because her dad was actually serving an 18-month prison stint, I guess for some kind of financial related crime with the family. I'm not 100% sure. But when Christine would have gotten home, her mom and her brother would not be there yet. So there was this little change jar they had in the house, and Christine had sorted through it. She took out a nickel, and then she was going to go run down to the general store. And her goal was just to go buy a piece of gum. And then she was supposed to meet her friend Leslie at about 4 p.m. at the park, which was across the street from the general store. Leslie got to the park at about 4 p.m. and she waited for her friend Christine. Then she waited. Then she waited some more. Then she kept waiting. Waiting. Christine never shows up. Now, just to be clear, there were witnesses who could say with absolute certainty that Christine Jessop was on that bus that day. She got off the bus. And so there was only a very small window of time when, something could have happened to her if something happened to her. At 4:10 p.m. is when Janet and Kenny arrive home. When they got there, they noticed that Christine's signature bicycle was lying on its side and the kickstand had been broken. And this was, I guess, near or inside the shed. Janet also made note that when they walked in the house, Christine's jacket was on the coat rack, but it was at the highest position, a position that 9-year-old Christine couldn't reach. Her backpack was there in the kitchen, so they knew that she had gotten inside the house. And the mail and the newspaper were also brought in, so they also knew that Christine, because she always did that, she brought all that in. By 5 p.m., Christine is nowhere to be seen. You know, her mom has been searching now for her for the past 40, 50 minutes or so, and to no avail. Janet will walk through the cemetery behind the house, calling out Janet's name. She walks to the general store. She walks to the park looking for her. Nothing. She then calls the home of her friend Leslie. Leslie answers and says, yeah, Christine didn't show up to the park when she was supposed to. Janet was, despite the comfort level that people tend to have back then, at least with like kids going outside and playing, Janet was the type of mom who kept she reined in her kids pretty well. Like, she was pretty much always on top of them. She rarely ever would leave them alone for any amount of time. That 20-minute window of time, on this particular day that's just the way it happened. She was always very watchful of them, and she always kept, a very close eye on them. She was a really, really good mom, but, you can't possibly keep your eyes on them literally every moment of the day. When the sun went down that night, Janet called the York Regional Police to report her daughter missing. Typically when kids go missing, at least back then, it was like, either the kids just ran away and they'll be home soon, which usually happened. But that was not the case this time. Or sometimes the parents, usually it was parents who were separated, and maybe the dad will end up kidnapping one of the children and taking them somewhere. But they knew that didn't happen here because, Christine's dad was in prison. And Janet, they could account for where Janet was the entire time. This was a very new scenario for the York police, I guess. They had a very tiny police force back then. They didn't really deal with missing people that often. They didn't deal with murders ever. And I guess the experience or the lack thereof was, it would end up, it essentially would hinder the case. So when the investigators came to the house, they did such a shitty job. Without wearing gloves, they would basically handle Christine's jacket to look at it, right? And they didn't collect any evidence off of it. They noticed that the plastic was still on the newspaper, that plastic sleeve. They handled it without gloves, and they never dusted it for fingerprints. There were, family and friends and neighbors who were allowed to come in and out of the house after police got there, just trampling everywhere, touching things, and it, completely destroyed the crime scene, and any evidence they could have gotten from it was just gone. They would set up a command post, I guess, at the nearby fire station. They would have primarily the residents of this town because, again, the police force wasn't that big. And so they would primarily consist of family, friends, and volunteers searching every single place they could think of. They are searching all of the wooded areas. They are combing through every bush, looking under every tree. They are digging, in certain places. They're looking in any bodies of water that may be nearby. They are searching high and low for Christine Jessop. Despite all of this searching they do, at first, there's nothing. They don't find any trace of her. Bob Jessop, who is Christine's dad, who, like I said, was in prison, was actually allowed to be released, I guess, on humanitarian grounds because his daughter was missing. And that way he and his wife could go on the news and they could talk about what's going on, and he could also help in the search. This is one of those situations where, even though they're inexperienced, the police do know that if this was an abduction, there is a strong possibility it was done by someone that Christine probably already knew, maybe. That was their guess, at least. And one person that came up almost immediately was a guy named Calvin Hoover. He was a friend of Bob's. Calvin was married to a woman named Heather, and I guess police would also interview Heather to see what her whereabouts were that day. Heather said she was at work all day long into the time that she would have been, Christine would have gone missing, which police confirmed. And all she could say was that she just could assume her husband was at work as well. Unbelievably, these inexperienced police officers would not interview Calvin Hoover. They never interviewed him at that time. Calvin Hoover at that time was a 28-year-old tradesman. He was a drinker, a partier, and he was addicted to gambling. Many people in his life would describe him as being incredibly selfish, very self-centered. And he could be very vindictive and very mean-spirited at times. But eventually Calvin Hoover would, become friends with Bob Jessop. Then the Jessops and the Hoovers became friends. They would do barbecues together, have parties together. They were close. Apparently on October 1st, 1984, just a few days before Christine disappeared, Janet would take Christine and Kenny over to the Hoover's house, which I guess they lived about 50 kilometers away. While they were at the house, in earshot of Calvin, Janet would tell Heather Hoover, I'm going to go visit Bob in prison, and, I'm probably going to leave Christine. I'll let Christine just stay at the house after school for a few minutes, just given the time frame of when she was expected back home, because, this wasn't like an environment for, Christine to be in, like in a prison. And like I said, Calvin was there and he overheard all this. So he knew that Christine was going to be alone for a period of time that day. But again, police wouldn't really know most of this until a long time later. Because like I said, Calvin Hoover was never questioned by police back then. Now we're days later after Christine has disappeared. They have continued to search for her. They're searching on foot. They're searching by vehicle. They are looking everywhere for her, and they come up with nothing. Days go by, weeks go by, months go by. And then December 31st, 1984. In, a hamlet called Sunderland, about 56 kilometers away from where Christine lived, there was a gentleman with his two daughters who were out looking for their dog on this big, large, open property. There was this long kind of dirt, desolate road, and as they were walking down it, this trail, they noticed this pile of what looked like garbage from a distance. They approached that pile of garbage and they realized that isn't garbage. It's a body. It is a decomposed body of a very small person. Even he could tell, this guy looking, that there were stab wounds in this little girl's body. So he calls police, and police get to the scene as soon as possible. They do confirm that this girl was stabbed numerous times. The body was dressed in a turtleneck with a blue pullover and a blouse with some missing buttons. Next to the body was a pair of little girl's underwear. And then a few feet away in the grass was a recorder. And on that recorder was the name written, Christine Jessop. And very soon afterwards, they confirmed that this was, in fact, the body of 9-year-old Christine Jessop. I guess in the community, people were like, wow, why was she found so far away, from her home? You wouldn't learn until a very long time later that Calvin Hoover had connections to people there in Sunderland. He visited Sunderland often, but police wouldn't know that right away. Once they found the body, police decided they needed to act fast. They needed to find the person who did this, not now, but yesterday, which they rushed into it, which would then give a lot of issues to the investigation as well. So they basically split this team into multiple teams of detectives who would investigate certain leads. And again, later down the road, they would see, they would have evidence in this box of someone being interviewed with regards to Calvin Hoover. But apparently the detectives who found or got the name Calvin Hoover, investigated that realm, were disregarded by the lead inspectors on this case. These weren't good detectives who got that name, and so that's nothing. They had suspects this kid in the neighborhood who was considered kind of like a weirdo, but they ruled him out. There was certain neighbors that appeared to be just kind of, off, but ruled him out. On February 14th, 1985, detectives will go back to the Jessops, Bob and Janet, and they asked them, who would do this? Do you know anyone who would do this? They couldn't think of anyone. They couldn't think of any names at all. So the detectives kept pushing them, do you have anyone, please give us the name of someone. They're like, we don't know who would do this. And there was so much pressure being put on the parents now at this point when Janet said something about one of their direct neighbor, a man named Guy Paul Moran. Janet had recalled that Guy Moran had never participated in any of the searches for Christine. He was this 25-year-old kid who always seemed to be nice enough, and didn't really ever appear to be off or anything like that. Janet said to the police, yeah, I know that Guy, he plays the clarinet. He had honeybees in his house that he kept, and I don't know, he was kind of a weird guy at times, sometimes, not all the time. But then Janet and Bob would both say, but for the most part, the Morans were a really trustworthy family, as was Guy. Yeah, he was a little weird, but he was a really kind person. We don't think he would do this. Guy Paul Moran was considered this handsome, smart, charismatic, very, very, very intelligent young man. Not the type of person you would ever really think would kidnap a girl and murder her. But then again, you never really realize who the monsters are until they're revealed. On February 22nd, 1985, these detectives, who again are very inexperienced in investigating things like this, they go over to the Moran house and they start to talk to Guy Moran. They ask him, well, how well do you know Christine Jessop? He's like, not that well. I'm 25, she's 9, I don't really know her that well. He told them, we didn't really interact much. We have a pretty large age difference. I had no reason to interact with her. He said one time, I think we were both outside and we were talking about gardening. That was about it. They asked him, where were you on the afternoon that Christine disappeared? And he said, I was at work. I work at a manufacturing facility. This was, I guess, 57 kilometers to the south of where everyone here lived. The detectives go to his work and they literally find his punch card, and that he punched out at 3:32 p.m. Based on the distance from where his work is to where Christine would have been taken from, he would not have gotten home until at the very bare minimum least about 4:14 p.m. But at that time, Janet and Kenny had arrived home already at 4:10 and Christine was already gone. And if you remember, Christine didn't show up to that 4 o'clock, play date she had with her friend Leslie. They then asked him, well, why didn't you help in the search for Christine? That's very unusual. The whole community was helping. And he said, quite honestly, the Jessops just never asked. They never asked me. And, he and his dad had other work they were doing that they were behind on. And they were just trying to get that work done, I guess, for a job. And he said at that point, the entire town was already involved in the search. So I just figured me and my dad can just keep doing this job while they're looking for Christine. No big deal. And it kind of makes sense, to be honest with you, but the detectives were like, no, this is fishy. This is very odd. Again, despite the fact that he could not have been there until at least 4:14 p.m., at least 15-20 minutes after Christine had already probably vanished. Detectives would say, well, we asked him, what did you think of Christine? What would you describe her as? He said, she always seemed sweet and she always seemed innocent, a sweet, innocent little kid. I guess when he answered that question, the detectives didn't respond right away. So there was this chunk of quietness. And he said out loud, but then sometimes they grow up to be corrupt, which Guy Moran does not deny he said, but he didn't mean that in any specific way. But the detectives were like, oh my God, that's motive. That's motive right there. What? They came up with this absolutely stupid concept that Guy Moran had predicted that this 9-year-old girl was going to become this corrupt, woman who would just mess and toy with men, and that made him mad. And so he took her and killed her. What? Meanwhile, this other guy, Calvin Hoover, by the way, who police are still not even remotely questioning or talking to or anything, he's playing the part. He actually helped in the search for the little girl. He went to the funeral. He consoled the family. He was there. At that point, Guy Paul Moran became their guy. He was the suspect. He did it. In terms of physical evidence, there was male bodily fluid on or with Christine, but back in 1984, they did not have the DNA technology that we have now to test really against anyone, but they did collect it, thankfully, and they stored it properly, unbelievably. She was also wearing a necklace, and then that necklace was a strand of hair that police also collected and stored, but again, in 1984, they couldn't do much with. A few weeks into the now murder investigation, Guy Paul Moran is, I guess, at a jazz concert. Well, suddenly there was these cosmetic people there one day. And this cosmetic person, who I guess was helping them with their hair and makeup, had asked everyone, hey, could we take a couple of plucks of all of your hair? Which is just a strange way to approach this, but, Guy Paul Moran was like, sure, whatever. And so they plucked his hair. Well, it turns out the cosmetic people, at least one of them, was an undercover cop. And I guess when they left, they literally threw away all of the hair samples but Guy Paul Moran's. They took Guy's hair and they brought it to a forensic scientist who I guess had experience with criminal investigations in terms of processing evidence like this. Again, in 1984, you couldn't, or 1985 at this point, you couldn't take DNA from a hair sample per se, not like we can now. So really, the only thing they could really do with a hair sample was look at it under a microscope and go, okay, they look the same. But a visual match is not a confirmed match that it's the same hair. The only thing they could do would be like, okay, this was like a black strand of hair found at the crime scene. Well, the hair sample we've gotten from a suspect is blonde. And so obviously that's not a match. The hair found on the necklace had been stored for roughly 3 months by the time they were doing all of this. And it wasn't stored great, and it had degraded over time, and the color of the hair had gotten lighter. And so this forensic scientist takes the hair sample from Guy Paul Moran and compares it to the hair sample found with Christine, and she said that was a microscopic match, that it was consistent with one another. Something also to note that in this police force, they, like I said earlier, they had broken into teams to investigate certain areas, and it became almost like a competition to see who could get there first, which would really be like, well, shouldn't we all be focusing on just the goal of solving this case and not who can get there first anyway? But these two detectives who had this hair sample brought it to, the head honcho and said, look at that, we got him, this is the guy. The FBI also became, or an FBI profiler, I should say, became involved with helping the police in Canada develop a profile. And they said this will be a person between the ages of 19 and 26, is a sloppy dresser. And so they would go on the news and they would announce this profile. But what they would do is they would conveniently leave out pieces of information from that profile that didn't fit Guy Paul Moran. And so when it was said on the news, Guy was watching the news with his dad, and his dad said, oh my God, that sounds like you. And so on April 22nd, 1985, when Guy Paul Moran was on his way to, I guess, a band practice, the police arrived and they arrested him. And well, he was like, what is this about? What am I arrested for? And they're like, you are under arrest for the kidnapping and the murder of Christine Jessop. And he's like, are you joking? Is this for real? What? Based on what? Guy Paul Moran would later recount that, as he's in handcuffs and he's walking into this police station, he sees the woman who actually took his hair from, when they got the hair sample from him. He's like, oh my God, that was an undercover cop. And inside he's like, Jesus Christ, she took my hair probably to match against something at the crime scene, right? And that's why I'm under arrest. And he's like, I cannot believe I'm about to take the fall for something I didn't do. Guy Paul Moran had an airtight alibi. He was at work, he clocked out at work, and he could not have gotten home to that area in time to have kidnapped, murdered, and disposed of the body of the 9-year-old girl. It could not have happened. The detectives came up with this well, obviously Janet and Kenny got the time wrong when they got home. They didn't get home at 4:10 p.m. They got home much later. That's where the issue is. But Janet was like, are you fucking kidding? Like, I looked at the clock when I got home. It was 4:10. They're like, no, it wasn't. You must have been mistaken. They actually said, well, your clock is running slow then. Your clock is broken. It's off. So, and they pressured her and they pressured her and they pressured her. And they like got so heavily into her mind that she got the time wrong that eventually she's like, okay, maybe I got home closer to 4:20, maybe 4:30. So Guy Paul Moran goes on trial with like the shittiest evidence. Like, I mean, they have this alibi, which is rock solid. Apparently, the prosecution planned to use a cigarette butt that was found near the body as evidence to say, yep, see, more proof that Guy Paul Moran did it. That's how good we are. Then they found out that Guy Paul Moran was not a smoker, never smoked a day in his life. And so what happened to the cigarette butt that they found next to the body? Because they did find it. Oops, it's lost. It's, uh-oh. They also found mysterious red fibers on Christine's body. And lo and behold, Guy Paul Moran's car had red, I guess, upholstery in it. Later on, they would find out that the forensic technician who was analyzing the fibers was literally wearing a red sweatshirt at the time with red fibers that would be identical to the red fibers found with the body. Well, what about Guy Paul Moran's family? What did they say where he was? Well, they said he actually hadn't even gotten home until 5:30 p.m. that day. Like, he could not have gotten back to us until about 4:14 p.m. based on the distance and when he clocked out, but we didn't actually see him until 5:30 p.m. This is because Guy Paul Moran had gone to the grocery store and to get gas. But police were like, oh, well, that's because his parents are protecting him and they are, they're part of this. Like, what are you guys going on about? So also, they put an undercover officer in the jail cell with Guy Paul Moran before the trial. This undercover officer would claim that Guy Paul Moran confessed to the crime and even did this motion towards his own chest, indicating that he had stabbed, a girl, the girl, in her chest. I guess Guy Paul Moran also used the phrase red rum to this undercover officer, and later on Guy Paul Moran would say he said he only said red rum to the officer in this jail cell because he couldn't think of the name of the movie where it came from, The Shining. But like, they took everything he said and did and they just twisted it into fit a narrative because they needed this to be Guy Paul Moran. It had to be him no matter what. There was just too much strange, odd behavior with Guy. There were inconsistencies. There were these things he would say that just, and then you have the hair sample and these red fibers. It's gotta be him. It's gotta be him. It's him. And then it got to the point where the jury it was time for them to deliberate. They came back and they found Guy Paul Moran not guilty. But there would be a second trial. This was because apparently there was a technical flaw that the judge gave to the jury in the first trial. And that's why a second trial was allowed to happen. By the time the second trial happened, police had lost some of the evidence. The evidence that really never actually linked to Guy Paul Moran really at all. Even some of their notes were missing. So this time, the prosecution or the Crown, they had this new theory. They said Guy Paul Moran must have seen Christine holding this new recorder and then lured her into his car by playing his own woodwind instrument, like a Pied Piper, they said. It was just asinine, but he actually took the stand and said, I didn't do this. I'm innocent. They're making all this shit up. I didn't kill her. Unbelievably, by July 23rd, 1992, at the end of this trial, Guy Paul Moran is now found guilty. Later on, a jury member would be interviewed and she said, I just knew Guy was responsible because he never looked at us, the jury. So I knew he was guilty. Bitch, what? This is why normal everyday people, shouldn't be on a jury ever. A jury should consist of people who are actually experts, who know these things, right? A jury of our peers? No, thank you. So at this point, Guy Paul Moran is 32 years old and he is sentenced to life in prison. By about 1995 or 1996, Guy Paul Moran was trying to appeal this case. And they found out that there was this breakthrough in DNA technology. And the prosecution was so sure of Guy Paul Moran's guilt that they said, yeah, let's test this DNA. It's got to be his. It'll prove our case. And he's like, yeah, let's do it. Test the DNA, because they did find semen on her body, which they still had. So they test the DNA. They run it against Guy Paul Moran's DNA. It is a 100% not a match. Wasn't his. 3 days after this revelation, he is completely released from prison. Every charge was dropped. Guy Paul Moran was now an innocent man. The man who had been dealing with this for basically a decade. But he knew that in the public's eye, because he had been found guilty, because this is how it always works, regardless of evidence, once a person's found guilty of a crime, the public is like, well, they're just guilty of it, so yeah. And so he knew he could never really be free until the actual killer was caught. It would not be until October of 2020 when police in Toronto police took over the case, thankfully. They finally got a hit on who the DNA belonged to. It was a man who was 28 years old at the time of Christine's disappearance, a man named Calvin Hoover. Where was Calvin Hoover now in 2020? He was dead. In 2015, Calvin Hoover ended his own life. Calvin Hoover had never been named or labeled a suspect at all. He was never interviewed, like I said earlier. The way they matched the DNA, by the way, was with the genealogical DNA, with the genealogical websites. There would be no justice for Christine Jessop. No justice at all. What they believe happened is, now that they've heard all of this information that they never really investigated before, that Calvin Hoover had overheard Janet talking about how essentially Christine was going to be alone at the house for a short period of time, that Calvin Hoover had driven to that area and Christine knew him. And so he probably said, hey, get in the car. And she probably said, oh, okay, Mr. Hoover, I'll do that. They also found out, in 2020, that Calvin Hoover had friends who lived in Sunderland, really right by where the body was eventually found. He was a smoker. They found a cigarette next to the body, which has suddenly gone missing. They knew that the Hoovers and the Jessops were a close-knit group, and they interviewed Heather Hoover, but never interviewed Calvin for whatever reason. They never found out where he was at the time of the kidnapping and the murder. They never even looked into it. Therefore, it would be way too late to ever know what his whereabouts were. They also found in their records of the investigation that Calvin Hoover's name had been in one of their notebooks, but was disregarded because the detectives working that lead were not good at their job. And obviously, police back then were like, well, Calvin Hoover's at the funeral. I mean, he's here, he's crying, he was there searching. We couldn't have done this. Of course not. The killer usually likes to interject themselves in the investigation and be around to see everything that's going on. So yeah, it's extremely possible. The hair found later on would be determined to belong to him as well. Physical evidence put Calvin Hoover basically at her murder, at her crime scene, on her body. Calvin Hoover was her killer. Calvin Hoover kidnapped the little girl, but we'll never really know why he did it. We'll never really know how exactly he did it, because he's dead, because he was never investigated. He was never looked at. He was never considered a suspect. He was never a person of interest. He was never anything. They didn't look at him. They just focused on this kid next door who people said may have been a little weird, but no physical evidence that could ever be confirmed put Guy Paul Moran at the site of the murder or on the body or anything. His alibi was airtight. There was just no physical way he could have done this, but he was still found guilty, but thankfully later exonerated. This was due to the shittiest police work some of the shittiest police work I have seen. If they had really looked into Calvin Hoover, a person close to the family, who we all know, typically this happens by people who are known to the victim. If they had done their due diligence, they had looked into him, maybe they'd taken his hair samples. If they'd done all of that, Calvin Hoover may have been the one arrested and in a jail cell, and maybe Christine Jessop would have gotten justice. But they didn't do anything with Calvin Hoover. They wanted it to be Guy Paul Moran, and that was it. That was it. And they were confident in it too. You drugged this innocent man through the legal system. You ruined his life. I mean, from now on, people are going to look at him as the guy who was at one point convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting and murdering a 9-year-old child. Despite this DNA clearing him, you still have that cloud over him the rest of his life. Because people are always going to be people, and they're always going to go, well, he was convicted, so maybe he did have something to do with it. Despite the physical evidence. That's just the nature of things. But it's frustrating. I hate these types of situations. It's so aggravating. We trust these authorities to do the work, find the right person. But this happens so often, not just here in the States. Obviously, it happens in Canada, like with this case. But at least Guy Paul Moran is a free man, as loosely as we can say that. Calvin Hoover ended his own life, never taking accountability for what he did to that 9-year-old child. And sadly, Christine Jessop, this innocent, sweet 9-year-old kid, did not get the justice she very rightfully deserved. And sadly, that is it for this case. True crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. Until the next case, true crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. Was that Southern mixed with like British Australian? What was that? Until next time, true crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongles. Until the next video. What am I doing, Mike? I don't even know. I like chicken. What about you? Well, this is awkward. So, there's a word. There's a word you say when you're done in a situation like this, when it's time to leave. There's a word, I can't think of it. So instead I said I like chicken. Which is true, by the way, I do. And turkey. I'm a meat eating person. I like meat. Gross. Well, shish kebabs on a chicken strip, turkey, meatball. And the dogs are snoring in the background, and I don't know what I'm doing. Anyway. Okay. Awkward. That hurt my jaw. Do you remember that movie, The Ring, right? When everyone, after they would die, right after 7 days, they would find the bodies and their faces look all like, like, it was like the face of fear, right? Frozen in fear face. Well, that ties into today's video, kind of. You see, today is Spooky Saturday. So basically, like every other Saturday, I'll tell stories, urban legends, or haunted places, or stuff about the normal that's very para, if you know what I mean. What is this? I'm already gay. I don't need to keep doing this. So I was playing a video game that one of you lovely people purchased for me off of my wish list, called Man of Medan. It's one of those games in the style of, The Quarry, or like those Walking Dead games where it's basically like every choice matters kind of thing. But anyway, and so as I'm playing the game, like I do with every movie, TV show, and video game I play, I go straight to IMDb and, like a lot of us do, live in the trivia section. And so as I'm looking at the trivia for this random game from a few years back, it mentioned that the game was based on a true story. Maybe. It's really more of an urban legend, unconfirmed true story. And it is the story of the SS Ourang Medan. The problem with this story, in terms of trying to see if it's valid or not, is it has many, many different retellings. It's believed that the origin of this story started sometime in like the early 1940s. The word Ourang is Indonesian for the word man. And then Medan is, I guess, a city, near an Indonesian island called Sumatra. So translating to, Man of Medan, hence the name of that video game. So the first story that ever was published about this said that the Ourang Medan was found by another vessel. This vessel had picked up some kind of SOS in the form of Morse code. The signal was coming from somewhere near the Straits of Malacca. The first story kind of refers to the Ourang Medan as a Dutch merchant vessel. The Morse code SOS they got said this: SOS from Ourang Medan. We float. All officers, including the captain, are dead. They're dead in the chart room and on the bridge. Probably whole of crew dead. And then the Morse code message ends with kind of like several of incoherent, beeps and boops. And then the last part was translated to, I die. And that's how the message ends. So, when this vessel gets to the location of the Ourang Medan, they see it. She's floating in the middle of the waters, motionless. An eerie silence sort of just beckons from the hull of the ship. You can hear a pin drop. The would-be rescue vessel kind of, pulls up close to the Ourang Medan, and then they begin to board the Ourang Medan. The ship itself, on the outside, completely undamaged. It hasn't been fired upon. It hasn't hit anything. There is no damage whatsoever. It looks to be in pristine condition. That same thing could not be said for those on board. Once they got on deck, they found body after body after body after body. Every single body was laying on their back, staring straight up with a look, as they described it, a look of fear frozen on their faces. All of them. As if the very last thing that these people saw was the most terrifying thing imaginable. Some said that these corpses appeared to be almost not even human, almost as if they were clay or mannequins, but they were human. They just didn't look that way. But then oddly enough, as they looked through every single body, none of them had any external injuries. None of them had gunshot wounds. None of them had blood around them. None of them appeared to be stabbed. There was no signs of beatings. They were all just dead and frozen in fear. So the crew of the vessel decides to get off the ship, and then they're going to tow the Ourang Medan to a nearby port. As they are tying up the ship, they notice a fire has broken out on the Ourang Medan. And then suddenly, there is an explosion from within the ship, the Ourang Medan. This apparently originated in the number 4 cargo hold. So all of the rescue people who were still on board managed to get off the ship, and then the Ourang Medan sank to the bottom of the ocean. Other stories about the Ourang Medan are pretty similar in nature. Really the only difference is the differences between all the stories that were told about it have a different origin time frame, like it was found in 1947 or early in the 1950s. But most of the stories say that the Ourang Medan was in the Strait of Malacca, and most of the stories say that the ship was littered with corpses. Some people described the corpses a little bit differently. Some say the corpses had their full teeth showing like a smile almost, and their eyes wide open. Not really necessarily a face of fear, just a very unsettling face. There has been apparently a couple of versions of the story of the Ourang Medan that says that there were no bodies whatsoever on the ship, that when it was found, everyone was gone, and that this was a literal ghost ship, that there was just nothing. everyone was gone, but were still no signs of any damage, of anything to indicate why they would all suddenly be gone, and why the SOS message. Another story is told from a supposed survivor named Jerry Rabbit, which totally sounds like a real name. Jerry Rabbit says that he had managed to escape the Ourang Medan on a lifeboat with 6 other men. When the lifeboat he was on washed up on the shores of Marshall Islands, he was the only one left alive. He said that he, along with several other passengers, boarded the Ourang Medan near Shanghai. And on the vessel were some suspect cargo, specifically 15,000 crates of suspicious cargo. And it had been loaded off somewhere in the middle of the ship's journey. Jerry Rabbit says he began to put it together that this was a smuggling ship. This wasn't your ordinary merchant vessel. They were smuggling goods. What kind of goods? Possibly drugs. So Jerry and the people who boarded with him near Shanghai, they were eating food on the ship, and they all started to suddenly get stomach aches. And he said when they started to complain about it, one of his friends who boarded with him, well, he died mysteriously. So this made him very curious, and he crept up and found the ship's logbook. The logbook stated that there were crates that had sulfuric acid, potassium cyanide, and nitroglycerin. What he came to the conclusion is that he thinks that one of these chemicals that were being smuggled on the ship had somehow leaked from several of the crates, and that the gases from those kind of began to slowly go throughout the ship, which is actually what was causing people to get sick. Jerry says this is when crewman after crewman after crewman began to just start falling dead, and a lot of them were starting to have what he thought were like hallucinations, that they were seeing things that weren't there, that everyone was terrified of something that was on this ship all of a sudden. Could they have been high out of their minds? So that's when Jerry and 6 other men decided to jump ship, literally, steal one of the lifeboats and get away as fast as they can. But somehow all 6 of the people he left with died. And then he, shortly after telling his story, also died. So here's the problem. Once the story began to circulate, people needed to look into this, because we're talking a mass death somewhere in the middle of the ocean, and now there's a ship somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. So people who were looking into this in the 50s, they found no records whatsoever of a ship called the SS Ourang Medan. This ship did not exist. No ship called the Ourang Medan was in any record books at all. And there were no official records of this ship sinking. They would search in this area where these people said the ship had blown up and then sank, but they allegedly never found anything. They also don't know exactly precisely where it sank. But then, if the story is true about the ship carrying not so legal goods, if they were smuggling these things, I should say, it is very possible that there would be no record of the Ourang Medan. These are not substances that they wanted people to know they were carrying. And while it wasn't common to have these sort of ships kind of not be processed and go through all the official records and all that, it wasn't common, but it did happen. So it's possible the Ourang Medan did exist, but someone went through great lengths to make sure it never had any records. But then you have stories from several people claiming to be witnesses to this event, and a potential survivor claiming about this event. And while the locations of where this event took place kind of changed subtly throughout different tellings of the story, and while the state of the crewmen's bodies did seem to also change kind of a little bit subtly throughout the tellings of the stories, the main focus pretty much stayed the same, always, that a ship somewhere in that area of the Strait of Malacca sent out an SOS some creepy SOS that the crew was dying. Then a vessel comes across the ship, finds bodies on the ship, all looking like they've just seen the most terrifying thing ever, and they were all dead. And then the ship blows up and sinks. The meat of the story is consistent throughout the tellings, but the details of the story, they change. The fact that there has been no recovery of the ship is a pretty telling aspect, because that'll tell you right there. If you found the boat, if you found the ship, then there's your answer. The ship existed. But if you haven't found the ship, I know the area is probably pretty large, but if you haven't found that ship anywhere, then does it even happen? Is it even real? So, the story of the SS Ourang Medan really has just gone down as an urban legend. It would go on to inspire movies like Ghost Ship, a terrible movie. It would go on to inspire the video game Man of Medan. Maybe the ship was in some kind of time travel situation, right? Remember that episode of The X-Files, fellow nerds? The episode Triangle, right? When Mulder was on the World War II ship, but in the past, and then Scully was looking for him, but on the abandoned ghost ship version of that same ship. Remember that episode? Brilliant, one of the best ever done. Kind of reminds me of that, so maybe it was aliens. Maybe aliens zapped them all, and that's why they look so like... Maybe. Who knows? Maybe the story's full of shit. Maybe it never happened. Or maybe there's a ghost sitting behind you right now. I don't know why there would be. That has nothing to do with the story, really. I didn't really talk about ghosts, right? So oh my god, I'm not joking this time. There's a man under your bed. You're not. Oh god. Check on your bed. Just kidding. I'm not actually kidding. There really is like a murderer under their beds. Yeah, ghosts and shit. Hey! So what do you think? Do you think the SS Ourang Medan is a true story? Or is it merely a fiction? Oh really? That's what you guys think? You think that? Okay, cool. No, you're wrong, but that's fine. Maybe you are on a ship right now and you don't know it. Maybe you're suspended in animation or whatever that phrase is. Maybe I'm not really here. Maybe I died on the SS Ourang Medan, and you're seeing me as a figment of your... This isn't making any sense. Or is it? Oh my god, I'm a sailor. Oh my god, I'm a sailor. Hey, how you doing? What? Oh, this is quickly becoming unhinged. Anyway... Arrgh, true crimerers, that be the end of this tale. Go wash your skivvies and eat your gold doubloons or something. Arrgh, arrgh, arrgh. It's not even pirate time. I don't even know why. The 40s? Come on. Pirates didn't exist in the 40s. Stupid. Ow. Fudge. But that is it for this kind of spooky tale. I mean, not really. Anyway, but in the meantime, I'll have true crime videos for you, so suck it up, buttercups, and deal with it. I don't know why I'm always so insulting to you guys at the end. You thought I was buffering, didn't you? You thought I was... You idiots!
Code in progress.
I did it harder. Was that bad?
No,
Was bad? I know CPR first aid. Come on, Barbs.
take him. Take him. Sir, come on over with me, okay?
Go at the officer, sir.
Come with me. Who is this?
My wife.
It's your wife? Okay. What happened? Do you know what happened? Okay.
There's a pipe.
There's
a pipe over here.
Come up here by the thing.
It's gonna be
Okay.
all right.
I don't know. Okay. Let first responders and stay right here. Okay.
A seemingly happy couple were involved in what the husband described as an insane freak accident, but the police would say it was cold-blooded murder. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Barbara Kendhammer. Viewer discretion is advised. This may be a case that a lot of you are probably familiar with, at least have kind of heard of before, but I thought it would be a really interesting case to still cover and talk about, because it's one that really does kind of make you think. Barbara Kendhammer was born as Barbara Carol Adams, and this was on March 4th, 1970. She was born and raised in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and she never really left. By 1988, she would go on to graduate from West Salem High School. And then sometime after that, around that time, she would meet a man named Todd Kendhammer. They would meet, they would date, they would fall in love, and it was just meant to be. On August 3rd, 1991, Barbara and Todd got married. They would eventually go on to have 2 kids together, and their names were Jessica and Jordan. Barbara worked in the food service department at West Salem Middle School, and she actually had that job for 14 years. She loved her job. She loved the students. Outside of work, she loved to craft. She loved to garden. She was also an avid camper and also an avid snowmobiler. Barbara was also a humongous lover of animals. She cared very deeply for animals, and she would always take an animal in if it needed, help. Throughout her life, she would own dogs and cats. She owned chickens, and she even owned a few donkeys. By the time this story happens, Barbara was a grandma, and she was loving absolutely every moment of it. She was a family person at her core. Family was the most important thing in her life. That included her husband, Todd. Their marriage was considered very, very strong. They were always looked at and observed as a very loving, nurturing, happy married couple. Sure, like every marriage, they're going to have issues from time to time. There's going to be arguments, but none of it was ever any different than any other normal marriage. People in their life would aspire to have a marriage like Todd and Barbara's. There were no affairs. They never laid a hand on each other. There was no money issues. They were pretty well off for the most part. In 2016, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, and by all accounts, they intended to go another 25. But unfortunately, that would not get to happen. Their solid, loving, embracing relationship would make what happens next so completely baffling. It was the morning of September 16th, 2016. Sometime around approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, Todd Kendhammer would make a panicked 911 call. This is going to be some of that call. It's not the clearest. It's staticky, but I just wanted you to hear a portion of it.
Hello? Oh, hi, this is the 911 center. You called me. I've got a yes, hang on. I've got police and ambulance, first responders headed to Emmons Cooley. I need you to tell me what happened. Slow down. Did the car need help? Okay. And so your wife is injured? Yes. Okay. Yes. And there was a car accident? Yes, a pipe or something came through her windshield. A pipe did. Pipe? Okay. What's your first name? Todd. Todd, okay. And they're going to help her until somebody gets there, okay? Hurry up. I've got Todd on the line reference that accident at Bergen Cooley in County M. He said a pipe or something came through the windshield. Tell me exactly what happened. It got her and she's hitting the head and in the throat, I think, in the throat or something. She's got blood coming out of her nose and mouth and it's really big and blue. How old is she? 46. Is she awake? No, I can't get her to really. She talked that first a little bit. Okay. Is she breathing? No, I don't think so. No. All right, sir. We do have help on the way. Stand along. How long? You're off the road. Sir, I want you to stay right where you're at, sir. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm going to try to do something with it. Yep, we're going to... I'm going to put the phone down. Can you get her out of the vehicle, sir? I got her out. Okay, I want you to lay her flat on the ground. I got her flat. I know first aid, but I don't know what to do with this. Okay. He's got blood coming out of his mouth. That's okay. Go ahead and pump it twice per second and 2 inches deep, okay? Okay. Let the chest come up all the way between the pumps. I'll come back in a minute. Okay, keep going, sir. She's got blood bubbling out of her mouth, Dad. That's okay. That's okay. We're going to keep pumping the chest hard and fast, okay? Pass out. I'm very doing great, sir. You're doing just fine. Keep pumping the chest hard and fast, 2 inches deep. Keep going, sir. You're doing great. How far out are they?
Essentially, Todd told the 911 operator that he and his wife had just gotten into a car accident. They were driving down this very rural stretch of road just outside of La Crosse, Wisconsin, when what Todd described as a long flatbed truck was carrying these, super long steel pipes. This is something that would probably be in a Final Destination type movie. As a matter of fact, I'm sure something almost similar with logs happened in the movies. But he says that one of these pipes flew off the truck and then somehow bounced on the road and then flew through the windshield and struck his wife, Barbara, what looked like in the neck and in the head. He basically told police that when the steel pipe was flying towards the windshield, he instinctively punched towards the windshield, the glass, in order to, I guess, stop it. He then says after it went through the windshield and hit his wife, he swerved completely out of control a couple of times, and then he landed backwards in a ditch. On the 911 call, Todd can be heard saying that she's not breathing. The 911 operator tries to walk him through CPR. He claims that he's doing it, and also he says he already had tried doing it before he called 911, but it appeared to him that she wasn't breathing. First responders arrive within minutes of this phone call taking place. They do determine that Barbara is actually still breathing. She has a very faint pulse, but she is still alive. They rush her to the nearest hospital, but unfortunately, by the following morning, Barbara would pass away. She never actually regained consciousness. Rewinding back now to the initial incident, when police arrived at the scene, Barbara was lying on the grass next to the car. Todd says that he had removed the pipe from the windshield because he needed to do that in order to get Barbara out of the car, and that's what he did. And then the pipe was just sort of laying on the ground. There were two very obvious, distinct cracks in the windshield, very large cracks. One of them did not appear to have any kind of punctured through hole, but the other one did have a hole which did fit the exact size of the pipe. So they can confirm that the pipe would likely have gone through the windshield. They just don't know how. There were traces of blood on the pipe. There was blood on the passenger side floor mat and on the center console, the front edge of the passenger seat, and in the shoulder area of the passenger seat belt. Where there was not blood was on the backrest of the seat or the headrest. The pipe hit her head and she was bleeding from there, according to Todd. They thought it strange that there was no blood on the headrest. Todd himself did have a few curious injuries. He had some injuries to his hands across his knuckles, which he says is because he had instinctively, he said he reacted and punched the glass, I guess in order to stop the pipe from going through the windshield. Not entirely sure what he was thinking, but he says it was just a quick gut reaction. My question there is, if he had time to see the pipe and react to it by punching the windshield, would he not have had time instead to just swerve the car out of the way? He also had scratches to his neck, and he had scratches to his chest. He says that those scratches came from his job. He worked, he had a couple, I think he had 2 jobs, but he did some part-time work, oddly enough, repairing windshields. And he says working with glass, he gets cut a lot. That being said, when the coroner was examining Barbara's body, they did take samples from underneath her fingernails. And then later on, they would determine that there was DNA in her fingernails that was not hers. It would soon be confirmed to be that belonging to her husband, Todd Kendhammer. He had scratches on his body. She had his DNA under her fingernails. That being said, this is a married couple. They've been married for 25 years. What they do in the bedroom is up to them. So they could not say for sure. No one could say for sure how his DNA got underneath her fingernails. They couldn't say it came from an altercation between the two of them or if it happened during something else. But police do believe that this was proof that Todd and Barbara had gotten into some kind of physical altercation, some kind of fight where she was trying to fight back. That's what they believed. His first interrogation happened, literally, I think, hours after the incident took place. He told police initially, because they asked him what was the destination of this trip. He said that he was driving to pick up a truck from a friend in order to fix the windshield of that truck. And then on the way, he was going to drop Barbara off at work. Police would question that friend. The friend said, "No, that's a lie. We made no arrangements. There was no plans for him to come over and get my truck." I guess they interviewed him a couple weeks later. Again, he changes his story now to say he was actually on his way to pick up a windshield from another friend I guess, for replacing another windshield somewhere. That friend was questioned. That friend also said, "No, that's not true. We had no arrangements. There was no plans to meet." So he has now lied twice about the destination of that trip. Next in their investigation, police would test the theory of could a metal pipe fall off a flatbed truck, as Todd explained, bounce. They allegedly tested this many times, and for the most part, their tests failed, meaning they could not replicate the incident. But there was one occasion where they were able to replicate it. They tested it, it bounced, and they even recorded this. We'll get back to that later. But it proves that while rare and uncommon, it is possible. So now police are interested about this truck. They scour CCTV, anything they could find from homes along the road, farming areas along the road. They do find a camera that is focused on that road. It's not up close, and they believe they see the Kendhammer vehicle driving down the road during the time Todd says they were driving. But police, what they do not see is they never see a flatbed truck anywhere in front, behind, next to, at all on that road. At any time before, during, or after Todd says this incident happened. Keep in mind, police also cannot confirm that the car they saw on that camera was, in fact, the Kendhammer car. It was far away. It was grainy. They looked for this truck. And actually, this was within minutes after responding to this incident, they had police going and driving down the roads looking for this truck because it couldn't have gotten that far. They never found it. This is a rural area where there's not exactly many places for this truck to have turned and, just gone forever. It should have been somewhat easy to find it. They never found it. They put out bulletins and, bolos and media stuff about, if anyone knows this truck, he didn't get a license plate, Todd. It all happened fast, according to him. They got nothing from any of it. No one ever came forward to say, that's my company's truck. No one ever came forward to say, ooh, I was driving a truck. And they got nothing. No witnesses, nothing. Keep in mind, let's just say, in theory, that this entire scenario is true. If they put out on the news that a woman is dead because a metal pipe fell off a truck. The odds of the person coming forward to say, ooh, that was my truck, and to incriminate themselves, people nowadays, the odds of them coming forward probably slim to nil. But it does also say a lot that truck just could not be found anywhere. And then another witness came forward to police. They said on that morning, they were driving down that exact same road and they saw the Kendhammer vehicle in the ditch area where it eventually was found. But this witness says there were no dents. There were no breaks in the windshield whatsoever. It was fully intact with no damage. So investigators at this point believe they have enough. And in December of 2016, they arrest Todd Kendhammer and they charge him with the murder of his wife. Their 2 adult children immediately stood by him and said, there's just no way our dad killed our mom. They were in such a great couple, such a loving couple. They never got in fights, like big fights. There was nothing to indicate that that our dad would ever do this. What would police say was Todd's motive? Well, that's the kicker. They couldn't find one. They found nothing. They dug deep into this couple, right? They interviewed friends, family, coworkers, just everyone. Not one person said that their relationship ever appeared to be strained. No one said they ever observed any significant fights. There were no affairs. They checked through computers and cell phones. No side relationships. There was no financial issues. They already had plenty of money. So a life insurance policy didn't really factor into anything. Like everyone they interviewed said, this couple was the real deal. That there's no way Todd could ever be violent towards Barbara and vice versa. So prosecutors had to rely on physical evidence. The windshield, like I said, had 2 very distinct cracks and breaks in it. The one in the center of the windshield, that's the one that Todd says he had punched instinctively, and that's why that crack is there. The other one directly in front of the passenger seat, obviously, is the one where he says the pipe went through. The defense produced witnesses who are experts with automobiles, experts with glass, windshields, that kind of thing. And they said that the center crack is very, very possible to have happened by Todd punching the windshield. And that the second crack was obviously the pipe. The prosecution would produce witnesses that would basically state that the center crack appeared to be like a failed attempt to hit the pipe through the windshield. Like they're suggesting that Todd had initially tried to go at an angle so it looked like it came from his side, like at an angle towards Barbara, but that he couldn't break the windshield. So then he went and tried again and he was finally successful on the passenger side, so then it would look more like a direct, straight hit through the windshield. The problem with this for both the defense and the prosecution's witnesses, there was really no way to prove or disprove any of that. The medical examiner who actually did the autopsy said that the injuries on Barbara were inconsistent with being struck by a metal pipe, the exact metal pipe in that matter, and that the physics behind it, how she would have been struck, I guess, multiple times because she had injuries in multiple locations on her face and her neck by a pipe going through the windshield and striking her what would have been one time, how she would have gotten those multiple injuries. So basically, the coroner said that the injuries on Barbara, because she also had scratches on her, she had bruises all over her body apparently. So they're saying that her cause of death was blunt force trauma, but not consistent with the metal pipe in this situation. The defense would not produce any of their own experts on this matter, but instead they would just kind of grill the actual medical examiner. They asked about something else in the car. So in the vehicle that morning, they found this big metal water jug that was Barbara's, and it was sitting on the floor of the passenger seat where it would have been by her feet. They asked the medical examiner that the injuries to her face, could they have been consistent if she had been maybe holding the metal jug up at the time and somehow either the pipe flew through the windshield and pushed it towards her face, or if she kind of instinctively used it as a shield kind of thing, that if that hitting her face would be consistent with the injuries. The medical examiner did not say that it's not inconsistent. They said it's possible, yeah. Couldn't confirm or deny it, but they said it is possible. The only issue with that is there was no blood on this metal container, and there really wasn't any damage to it to suggest that a person slammed so hard into it that it caused them to die. Todd would testify in his defense, and he was asked, hey, why did you tell two different stories where both of them were confirmed lies? He said that, the first time he was interviewed was literally within, his wife was on the brink of death. His brain was scattered. He was everywhere emotionally. He said he doesn't even remember talking to them. The second time, he kind of says he was still in that whirlwind thing. But this is weeks later where he had more time to compose himself. But if you're also going into an interrogation and you're thinking you're being accused of something, your brain may be a little foggy. The defense would produce, I guess, experts, a couple of them, to state that, there is a certain level of trauma that would be consistent with what he says he went through to make his brain kind of react that way and just sort of tell whatever he could think of the time. But at the same time, why lie about your destination? It seemed kind of silly. And if you're lying about your destination, what else are you lying about? But like I said, psychologically, it's possible that he could have just been completely blah, blah, blah. The prosecution would need to come up with something because they're saying that the accident itself was a staged scene, that he staged it after she was already dead, that he must have loaded her into the vehicle and then brought them to this destination because it was rural, it was out of the area. Not many witnesses or any witnesses would see this. And then he had time to set it up. So they basically said that they must have gotten into an altercation at their house where he was violent with her and beat her and killed her. But they never found any actual physical evidence at the house, nothing extreme that would point to a murder being taken place there. And so when it came to the conclusion of the trial, the jury would agree with the prosecution. And Todd Kendhammer was found guilty and convicted, and he was sentenced to 30 years to life for the murder of his wife, Barbara. Shortly after his conviction, Todd would hire some new attorneys, one of them being a man named Jerry Buting. And some of you may know him very well. I know I do, because he was Stephen Avery's attorney, because this takes place in Wisconsin. So he was Stephen Avery's attorney during the murder trial. That's a whole other thing, of course. But he, along with an associate of his, would take over this case kind of in the appeals process. And he actually was pretty successful pretty quickly of getting an evidentiary hearing because, if you remember, I said earlier that the police had filmed their pipe drop test to see if it was possible that the pipe would bounce and fly through the windshield. And like I said, they were able to successfully repeat what he claimed happened one time, meaning that it was possible. But the defense never saw this video. The prosecution, I don't know if they deliberately withheld it or what the situation was, but that video was never shown in court. Because obviously, if you show a video where it was possible, that would throw a huge wrench in your plan to prosecute and convict this guy, because you're saying it's impossible. So they were able to play this video for the judge at the evidentiary hearing. They also produced a couple more medical examiner experts who went over the autopsy reports in grave detail. And these experts determined that the conclusion that the original medical examiner had, that the injuries on Barbara's body could not have been consistent with what Todd said happened, well, that was basically not true. They were able to determine that the injuries from a pipe could have been reasonably possible, because originally they're like, well, there's multiple locations around, so how has she been hit with a pipe more than once? And that's simply explained by force, gravity, that kind of thing, physics. So if the pipe had gone through the windshield, it may have initially hit her, and then she may have fallen at high speeds back into the pipe at a different angle. The pipe could have jostled around and struck her again. There are things that could have happened where she could have gotten those injuries in the way Todd said. These same experts said that these injuries were actually more not consistent with a physical assault, that they were actually more consistent with what Todd said happened. But as recently as May of 2022, Todd Kendhammer was denied a new trial. I do know that he continues to plan to appeal this, but that is where it stands now. He is still in prison for the murder of his wife. It is the prosecution's job, as always in this country, and I'm sure other countries, to prove a person's guilt, as we all know, beyond a reasonable doubt. I don't think the prosecution did themselves any favors by withholding that evidence, that video, proving that it was possible, rare, but possible, to have happened the way Todd said it happened. To me, that's very telling that they didn't want people to see that video. Personally, I think Todd's story sounds absolutely cuckoo, bonkers, and super implausible, but it's possible. It doesn't matter what I or a juror thinks sounds crazy and absurd. What matters is the actual evidence and the proof. And while it is an extremely rare thing, we also need to acknowledge that freak accidents, and I've covered freak accidents over on TikTok a lot, they happen. And sometimes they are absolutely bizarre. They're 1 in a million, but they happen. If I was on this jury, I don't think I could, if I'm wanting to uphold the standards of the law, I don't think I could have said confidently, guilty, because there was no established motive whatsoever. Nothing financial, no affairs, like I've said, nothing. There was never any extreme fighting between the two of them. And then withholding that video, having kind of like these inconsistent theories about, and not being able to really say for sure how she died. They're basically just sort of guesstimating. It's all very telling. But then I also think to myself, Todd Kendhammer is a person who literally works on windshields basically for a living. What are the chances of a situation arising where a windshield is a prime piece of evidence in a possible murder? Is it because he knows them so well that he figured he could have broken the windshield, but then it didn't work, and so he had to like do a second hit to the windshield? I don't know. That part's a little weird to me. It's a little weird about the lies about where they were going. But again, this could be a mental slip up. You don't see that much. Usually people are just flat out lying. So I don't super trust that portion, but who am I to judge, I guess? But also, did they really prove beyond a reasonable doubt? I know it sounds crazy, but this is a crazy one. This is a bizarre story. And I would, at the end of the day, I don't know. I would hate for a man to be imprisoned for something he did not do. We see it so much, especially in Wisconsin, right? I don't know, you guys. I don't know how I feel about this one. This is one I've definitely heard of this case before. I've even watched, I know, a true crime documentary on it before. I'm sure many of you have. I just thought this would be a really interesting one to kind of like discuss. But I am very much on the fence. I hope he's not an innocent man in prison, because that sucks. Because now, you know, their kids have now basically lost both their parents. The whole thing sounds so absurd, so unbelievable, that it has to be true, right? But it's also so absurd that it rarely happens. Did this happen that way? I don't know. But that's it for this case. True Crime Maroonies. I hope you found it interesting if you had never heard of this one before.